Welcome to Civics and Coffee. My name is Alicia, and I am a self-professed history nerd. Each week, I'm going to chat about a topic on U.S. history and give you both the highlights and occasionally break down some of the complexities in history and share stories you may not remember learning in high school, all in the time it takes to enjoy a cup of coffee. Hey everyone, welcome back. A few weeks ago, I had the honor of sitting down with author Robert B. O'Connor to discuss his book, Jeep Show. It is a historical novel about World War II and the role of the U.S. Army Morale Corps in maintaining the energy and spirit during the toughest moments in battle. O'Connor lives and writes in Memphis, Tennessee, and we recorded our interview over Zoom, so I am inserting my standard sound quality warning here. I hope you all enjoy the conversation. Hey friends, with me today is Robert O'Connor to discuss his historical novel, Jeep Show, A Trooper at the Battle of the Bulge. Welcome, Robert.
Thank you so much, Alicia. It's really a pleasure to be here with you and on the podcast.
Well, thank you so much for being here. Let's go ahead and dive right in. So let's start with, how did you come to the decision to write a fictional account of World War II?
Well, I was working on a book about a famous circus, famous because it was a complete disaster, humorous only in retrospect, called the Oxydol Circus. The promoter of the Oxydol Circus was a man named Jim Hetzer. He has been gone a long time, but I managed to reach his daughter for an interview, and she explained his career in the circus, and she also explained that in World War II, he had been an enlisted entertainer. And I said, Kathy, I didn't know there were enlisted entertainers in World War II. And she said, oh, yes, they did, among other things, they did Jeep shows in frontline combat areas where the USO and the Red Cross could not go because these were soldiers. And she said, and by the way, my father's squad leader for his Jeep show was Mickey Rooney, the Hollywood actor. And so I became more and more interested. And then she topped it off by saying, by the way, my father's older sister, my Aunt Mabel, saved every letter he wrote home from training camp and from the European Theater of Operations. So I was, oh my goodness, primary sources. I decided, so I abandoned the circus project for now, and I may get back to that, but, and I decided to make it fiction because I wanted the challenge of writing fiction. I'd already written a nonfiction book. And secondly, I wanted to involve the main character in the Battle of the Bulge. The Battle of the Bulge was the largest and remains the largest battle ever fought by the U.S. Army and was extremely important for the outcome of the war in Europe in World War II. So that's the obvious way I became inspired to write the book. Now, the other thing, the more, if you will, introspective inspiration is, every novel is to some extent an autobiography. And, the characters I dreamed up, and it is fiction, and the characters I dreamed up and the situations and the scenes are all, refracted through my imagination. I did my research, but they're refracted through my imagination, and my imagination is refracted through my own life experience. And so this main character, this fictional character, is caught at the front lines right after a Jeep show, right after a show where he gets left behind, and he kind of does a stumbling, fighting retreat through several battle scenes and other scenes, and then ends up in Bastogne, supporting the 101st Airborne in their famous defense of Bastogne. Well, I often feel when I look at my life that there's been a series of stumbling, fighting retreats. And, I ended up in a place where I kind of had to turn and fight. And, part of that was just writing this book and seeing if I could bring it to life successfully, which people tell me I have. So that's the inspiration is both, boy, what a great story. Enlisted entertainers doing Jeep shows, and Mickey Rooney, who was a genius and a completely eccentric character. And then, kind of refracting it through my own experiences in life and seeing where that led me.
So your protagonist is Jim Tanzer, and he goes through kind of a significant transformation from show business dropout to kind of living through these intense realities of war. And I know you mentioned in your previous answers, some of it was a little introspection on your part. So how much do you think Jim came from your primary sources, and how much did he come from some of your own kind of proverbial life events?
Well, the primary sources were just an inspiration, but it did kind of tell me the milestones of an enlisted entertainer in World War II. So I took it from there, I think. And then, in my research, I came, I learned about a lot of stories by individual soldiers who were not entertainment soldiers, and not necessarily in Europe during the war, and maybe not in the Battle of the Bulge, but had other fascinating, sometimes dangerous, sometimes humorous adventures. And I just, I took my gifts where I found them. And so I would take those stories and, kind of turn them inside out and upside down and put them in the book. So in a way, the main character, Jim Tanzer, and his adventures are a composite of many, many American Army soldiers, almost all enlisted men, because it became obvious to me that the American Army in World War II was a completely unique phenomenon that I'm sure we won't see again. The Army, Alicia, was larger than the Navy and the Marines and the Army Air Corps combined. So the Army had to rely on the draft. And as a result, the Army was a very accurate representation of America as a whole. Now, young America, age 18 to, 29, and male, of course. Yeah. It was so important to me to tell that story. The Army drafted PhDs, and they drafted men with a fourth grade education. My father, who was in the Army in World War II, told me that there was a boy in his barracks who said this was the first time he had his own pair of shoes. So, it's a composite of many, many, many enlisted men's experiences, and to that end, the main character, Jim Tanzer, the changes he goes through as he faces battle, retreating and fighting and turning and fighting in Bastogne, and also putting on a show in Bastogne for the wounded soldiers, are kind of a composite of many, many soldiers' experiences during the war.
Yeah. You did a lot of research for this book, and there's definitely some signal posts that prove that point. And one of the parts of the story that I thought was kind of cool was that it dives into the Morale Corps. So what was that, and what role did it play during the war?
The Army was a big believer in Napoleon's famous quote about morale. He said, in war, morale is to the physical as 3 is to 1. And the Army took great pains to try to maintain morale of all its troops, and particularly the frontline troops. So there was a morale corps that was responsible for these Jeep shows, these shows that the main character and Mickey Rooney did, but also there were soldiers who were responsible for athletic equipment, and the Army showed thousands of movies. And in fact, Hollywood sometimes sent movies to the Army before they were distributed to the general public. And there was such a thing called the Armed Forces Edition, where the Army printed millions of books and printed them kind of sideways and small so they would fit in the pocket of a soldier's field coat. And you would very often you'd see, a soldier in the foxhole reading, say, A Tree Grows in Brooklyn was the number one favorite of the soldiers. And so a soldier would get through half of it and he'd rip that half off and give it to his buddy and he'd continue reading the second half. The Army went to great pains to provide programs, including learning programs and services for the soldiers. Now, in the front lines, because the front lines in combat areas are so isolated, really it was just these Jeep shows that made it to those combat soldiers. And what I learned is, of course, they loved the show. Imagine if Mickey Rooney, one of the most talented comedians and Hollywood actors that has ever lived. Imagine if you're sitting 6 feet away from him, on a piece of cardboard watching him do his act. But so it was the show and laughing and, taking your mind off your troubles. But it was also the being present. It was that these entertainment soldiers were physically present right there just behind the front lines. And there's something, as I reflect about morale in my own life, when I think about, if a friend is really going through a tough time, maybe they lost a family member or their dog, or, they're divorced, getting a divorce. The best thing we can do for them is not usually giving them the solution to all their troubles. It is just being present. Yeah. Just hanging out, playing cards, whatever. And that fact, that was very, very important to the morale of the frontline soldiers in these Jeep shows. Yeah. Now, I will say this, the most important morale booster or, spirits booster of combat soldiers, whether they're, American or German or Ukrainian now, is they really aren't fighting for, democracy by the time they're, in combat or grand ideals. They're fighting for each other. Yeah. They're fighting for their buddies. And what I found over and over again is soldiers who were wounded, but not wounded enough seriously to be evacuated to England or America, would leave the hospital even before they were discharged to try to make it back to their unit, even though that was, you're making it back to a very tough and dangerous situation, because that's what they were in it for. They were in it for their buddies. And there's a lesson in that for all of us, even though for most of us, our lives are not as fraught, as a frontline combat soldier, but still for morale purposes, we're in it for each other. And, if we think about not only, what we want to do for ourselves, but we think about what we want to do for our family and for close friends, which are like family, only maybe better. That's where our morale, that's really at the basis where our morale comes from, is we're in it for each other.
That's a lovely sentiment. And as the title kind of indicates for the book, this novel kind of explores the intersection between entertainment and war. And, you spoke a little bit about kind of what drew you to this idea. But I'm also curious, did this theme impact your depiction of the soldiers' experiences? And if so, how?
These entertainment soldiers, military occupation, especially 442, were not fighting with bullets and artillery. They were fighting with, guitars and comedy routines and songs and dance. And by the way, in the shows at the front line, they would always pull a GI out of the audience because, his buddies again would say, "Hey, Bill does an incredible impression of Edward G. Robinson," or something like that. So I wanted to show how that contributed, as well as to show how an entertainment soldier, the protagonist, was forced to shift from what his trade was, which was song and dance, to what he was trained to do at basic training, which is fire a rifle and, try to kill the enemy. So, yeah, they get very intertwined, and it kind of changes back and forth. And as I said, when he gets to Bastogne, one day he's fighting, and then another day he's putting on a very funny show using soldiers for the wounded soldiers in the basements, which lands him in a great deal of hot water with some starchy collared officer the next day.
Yeah. And I'm curious, when you were writing out the parts of the story, were there sections where you said, okay, I'm only going to talk about the Jeep shows today. I can only write, my mind can only be around Jeep shows today. And today I'm going to write about more the more realistic aspects of war. Or did it just flow through you?
Well, first of all, I did way too much research, as you picked up, and my editor cut out thousands of words that were, to me, fascinating and revealing, but were actually in the way of the flow of the story. But then eventually, after I decided I had to stop all the fun of research and really start producing a story, I worked out a basic chapter flow. And so then, like chapter 1 through 20 or so. And then I took it one chapter at a time, starting with chapter 1 and grinded it. Grinded is not the right word, is it, Alicia? ground it out somewhat painfully. But to your point about, chapter 5, I think, is about the actual Jeep show that Mickey Rooney and the main character and their buddy do in a frontline place called Hosingen in Luxembourg. And so when I was doing that was probably 2 months, maybe more, of making up the components of the show based on my studies of vaudeville and movies of the late 30s and what was considered funny. I listened to a lot of radio comedy from the late 30s. So, for 90 days, I was living completely in, creating what would be a plausible Jeep show. And then, another one that was like that, only much less pleasant. In one chapter, the protagonist is present at the liberation of a concentration camp in, I guess, April of 1945. And, to tell that story respectfully and factually, I obviously, as a history major, I was very familiar with the Holocaust and the concentration camps, but I went back and studied this particular camp, which was called Ohrdruf, for several weeks. And this was the first camp that General Eisenhower, the Supreme Commander, visited. And when he visited, it was filmed. And that film was shown in the United States under the title of Murder Camps, which is the original name we gave to these terrible, terrible, evil things. So, I spent 90 days in that, and it was both, I'm sort of catching in my throat just to think back on that, but it was both, terrible to study and also inspiring to study and think about the people that survived that and how they went on to live their lives, and the role of the American soldiers and in different places, the Russian soldiers, the Soviet soldiers, in liberating these camps. And, in that chapter, I have one of the survivors addressing the Americans from a distance and in Yiddish, of course. And it's translated right away because it's dialogue, but, and saying American Angels, American Avengers. So yes, I didn't jump all over the place to do justice to these different things. I immersed myself kind of one chapter at a time in my voluminous notes.
And we have talked about this a little bit in prior questions, but giving you a chance to expand if you want. Why were things like theater and entertainment important parts to the war effort? I know we talked about morale, but I got the sense that there was lots of important factors to why the entertainment for the soldiers was so important.
Well, when you're talking about the frontline soldiers, the importance was, as I said, just to give them some relief from the very, uncomfortable, dangerous, and often boring, life of a frontline soldier. For the rear echelon soldiers, which was, 85% of the army was in service, supply, logistics, other things. It was to keep them out of trouble. You take a 19-year-old soldier and he's bored and he goes to, if it's in the States or even in Europe, he goes to town and he goes to places where he probably shouldn't be going. And so there was a great effort with the sports equipment and the baseball games and all the movies. And then in the rear echelons, they put on what they called soldier shows, which were amateur productions using soldiers for the cast and the crew. So in the rear echelons, it was just to try to keep them out of trouble. And at the front lines, it was to try to provide some relief from the stress of the unbelievable stress of being, in combat. And it's important to note, American infantry were not relieved and sent back to the States after a year or something. They were, unlike the British and unlike the American Air Force, who did a very dangerous job also. If you were an infantryman in the American Army, you were basically there till either you were killed or wounded or the war ended. So these frontline soldiers were under a tremendous amount of strain, and the entertainment was an attempt to, give them some relief.
And he's been brought up a few times in your previous answers, but I know that I found it to be a bit of an Easter egg to turn the page and find Mickey Rooney was going to be part of the story.
Yeah.
And so what was the motivation behind including the Mickey Rooney into your book?
Well, the most important motivation was he was really there, really doing Jeep shows, and the real person who I found out about by talking to his daughter was in Mickey Rooney's Jeep show squad. So I was able to read some of his letters about working with Mickey Rooney. So, it really happened that way. And then the other thing is, Mickey Rooney is such an interesting person. He was considered an absolute genius by the directors who worked with him. He could, not only was he a great actor and comedian, but, he could do stand-up. He could do, he was great at impressions. He played the drums at a professional level. He could dance. He was a great dancer. He was a genius, and where there are great strengths, Alicia, there are corresponding great weaknesses. You probably know, and his private life was completely off the rails. To say he was a hard partier is a major understatement. But he was there, and he chose to go to Europe. He did not have to. He was under some pressure to enlist in the army because all men his age, celebrities or not, were under some pressure. But he could have done his service honorably at the Hal Roach Studios in Beverly Hills. Lieutenant Ronald Reagan served honorably there doing films for the Signal Corps. Mickey Rooney chose to go to Europe and be in the Morale Corps and do these Jeep shows, which were dangerous, in artillery and sniper range. And imagine if the Germans had captured Mickey Rooney, and I I have kind of come to the conclusion in my own mind that he did that, A, because he was patriotic and wanted to support the boys over there, but secondly, because he knew that his Hollywood lifestyle was killing him.
Mm.
And he wanted to get as far away from it as he possibly could, and he did.
And so we touched on this as well a couple of times, but I am curious, what was the research process like in putting this book together?
Well, first of all, I read, as I said, this real human being, Jim Hetzer, all his letters from the war were saved. And as it happened, his daughter published them in a book.
Mm.
So not only did I speak with his daughter, but I was able to read all his letters. So it started there. I read a good deal of nonfiction about World War II, including the Army. I think it was in the 50s, did a series of very scholarly, they were called the Green Books. And the Army analyzed the war in about 5 or 6 green books. And I did not read them cover to cover, thank you, but I was able to go to the sections that I needed to see to understand. For example, as you know, there's a chapter in occupied Germany after the war, and there was a great deal of fascinating information about what was happening in occupied Germany after the war. It's a fascinating time and place. So I had that. I read several excellent nonfiction books about the war, and then I read several books about the Battle of the Bulge, and then I kind of I got granular. Then I read several books about the 28th Infantry Division, which had been in the Battle of the Bulge. And then I read a book about a certain company in the 28th Infantry Division. So I was well versed in the facts on the ground of the war there. And I don't think I said, but I probably intimated, research is fun and writing is hard. And at some point I was like, okay, I've done, I've got to start telling this story. But it helped to have a great deal of background information because I could pick out, really the parts that I thought were best, and then later the parts that my editor thought were best, which was even more, even stricter. And for example, I was able to put in, speaking of Easter eggs, Mickey Rooney is a giant Easter egg and not very hidden. But I put in for World War II buffs, which is my target audience for the book, by the way, Alicia, for World War II buffs, I was able to put in things like there was a condition called M1 Thumb. The M1 Garand rifle was an automatic rifle, and it fired a clip of 9 rounds. You opened the bolt and jammed that clip into where it went, and the bolt would snap shut on its own with tremendous force. And if you were inexperienced or unlucky, your thumb would be in the way of the bolt on its way back to its starting point, and you would get it would be very painful, and B, you would get a bruise on your thumb that lasted for several months. And I referenced that there's a drill instructor is talking to the main character and several other GIs in training, and he says, "Now you love your M1 rifle, don't you?" And Jim looks down at his thumb and he thinks, "I do not love my M1 rifle." So all that research, of course, gave me the structure of the story, but it also let me put in some fun, subtext for World War II buffs.
Yeah. And you've written both nonfiction and now this novel here. I'm curious for your thoughts on how can historical fiction help people understand the past?
First of all, I think that historical fiction can help people understand the past because many people are not interested in reading nonfiction. And, when you get to a topic like World War II or the Army in World War II, it's daunting. There's 100 great books on World War II from the American side, let alone the Brits and the Russians. So it helps to reach readers who are interested in reading a good story. And, if you're not accurate with your, main facts in historical fiction, you lose your readers. So you're getting across the main facts about the defense of Bastogne, or the early terrible days of the Battle of the Bulge, or, the Army's efforts to maintain morale among its soldiers. You have to be correct about those facts. But once you're correct about, the framework of facts, you can make up anything you want about, an individual soldier on the ground, which I certainly did. So I think, to answer your question, the most important thing is it gets across the key facts to people that wouldn't be exposed to them without that. And as I said earlier, I really wanted to get across to people what it was like to be in the Army in World War II. And my dad was in the Army in World War II. So the whole exercise made me feel closer to him as well. And I wanted other people to have that feeling as well.
Yeah. I mean, for what it's worth, I thought you succeeded in your mission. I definitely felt like I was kind of living through the war in Jim's eyes. So
thank you. That's music to my ears. I certainly did the best I could.
Yeah, you did well. And so where should people go when they've finished your book and they want to know more about you and what other work you might have available?
There is a website called jeepshowbook.com. It has information about sources. It has my uninteresting biography, or my run-of-the-mill biography. And by the way, it also has, at the end of the book, in the last draft, I had an epilogue where one of the characters, the war correspondent, writes a column, an opinion column, looking back on the war from the standpoint of 1946, and describing the American soldier in the war. And I love that column. It's fiction. I made it up, but my editor made me take it out. And it's hard when you really love something, but if you're smart, you listen to your editor. But I stuck it on the website. So this column that the war correspondent wrote is on the website. I think it's the best thing on the website.
Okay. And I know you just are getting done with Jeep Show, but before we started recording, you intimated that you may be working on another project. Are you ready to talk about that yet?
Yes, certainly. And if I talk about it, maybe it'll happen. The GI Bill was passed in late 1944 and changed American society. The GI Bill gave veterans of World War II both inexpensive loans to buy homes, but even more important, basically paid for them to go to college or trade school. So several million GIs, including my father, who would never have gone to college, who were from blue-collar working class background, who would never have been able to afford or even consider going to college. Several million GIs, including my father, went to college, and thus they then took up white-collar occupations. They then made sure that their many children got college educations, and it completely changed the fabric of American society moving forward. So I want to send Jim to college on the GI Bill, even though he's very old to be in college. I think that will be funny. And in the meantime, I think his wife will be, who is much more talented an entertainer than he is, will be working in New York, and they'll be raising children. So that's my starting out goal, is to show through story, again, the facts of the impact of the GI Bill on American society.
That sounds exciting. I can't wait for it to come out.
Thanks, Alicia. Don't hold your breath. It's hard.
Oh, I'm sure it is. And is there anything that we haven't talked about yet that you want future readers to know?
We talked about it, but I'll just emphasize that and what hopefully they'll get from reading Jeep Show is the uniqueness of the American Army in World War II and how it represented all parts of American society. And I think we have lost sight of that. It'll probably never happen again. And it's I think, one of the best parts of what we call, quote unquote, the good war. One last thing I would say, and I've talked to many, many veterans since I finished the book. In no way does Jeep Show glorify war or battle, and I would never want anyone to think that that is a fit topic. War is absolutely awful. It is as bad or worse for the civilians caught up in it as for the soldiers, and it's horrible for the soldiers. And at the very least, in World War II, even if you weren't fighting at the front, you gave up 2-3 years of your young life and were in the Army. So it's very important, I guess. Last thought is, war is not to be glorified.
Yeah. Well said.
Thank you.
And so for all the listeners out there, be sure to grab yourself a copy of Jeep Show. It is a page-turning, engrossing historical novel that is an engaging dive into the past. Thanks again, Robert.
Thank you so much for letting me talk with you and letting me talk with your listeners.
Thanks again to Robert for spending his time with me. For any of you out there who enjoy historical fiction, I recommend picking up a copy of Jeep Show for a nuanced portrayal of a pivotal moment from our past. Thanks, peeps. I'll see you next week. Thanks for tuning in, and I hope you enjoyed this episode of Civics and Coffee. If you want to hear more small snippets from American history, be sure to subscribe wherever you get your podcasts. Thanks for joining me, and I look forward to our next cup of coffee together.